vous êtes, je t'aime, vous êtes, je t'aime. Tu m'avais manqué, vous êtes, je t'aime, vous êtes, je t'aime. Tu m'as préféré, vous êtes, je t'aime, vous êtes, je t'aime.
Hello and welcome to Brussels, my love, our weekly talk show about European affairs, where we take a look at some stories that hit the headlines this week and find out what is at stake for you and Europe. I'm your host, Stefan Grobe, sitting in for Maeve McMahon. Thank you for joining us here on the set, on TV and online. So, coming up in this edition, the European Union in the Middle East, soft power or paper tiger. As Brussels gears up for massive humanitarian aid for Gaza, EU leaders stress the need for long-term resolution to the Israel-Hamas conflict. This contains no reoccupation and no forced displacement. They also emphasize that the Palestinian Authority should take over in Gaza while moving towards a two-state solution. The question is, does anybody care? How much does EU diplomacy matter in this part of the world? And Pedro Sanchez is back in power, but at what political price? His decision to accede to some of the demands of Catalan pro-independence parties have proved profoundly divisive. They made their backing for his new government dependent on an amnesty for hundreds of people involved in the illegal referendum to secede from Spain. The conservative opposition in Madrid cried foul, and so did hundreds of thousands in the streets. Is Sanchez's move a threat to the rule of law? Let's bring our panel now and try to get answers from Kate Bolongaro, Managing Editor Europe at MLEX, Sven Biskup, Director of the Europe in the World program at the Royal Egmont Institute for International Relations and Professor at Ghent University, and Sandra Pasaric, Project Officer at the Martin Center for European Studies. Welcome to all of you, and thank you for joining me in our studio in Brussels. So let's start with the Middle East. The European Union is doing in the Middle East what it does best, funding projects. That seems to be the only thing that the 27 governments can agree on. Consequently, the European Union oftentimes looks like a resourceful bystander rather than a powerful mediator in this eternal conflict. Take a look.
As the war between Israel and Hamas rages on, the European Union has approved financial support to the Palestinian territories. The EU will continue giving development aid to the Palestinian people after an audit by the Commission found that European money was not going to Hamas. Already the largest donor to the Palestinian territories, Brussels has committed more than €1 billion to development funds between 2021 and 2024. The move comes as Europe finds itself more divided than ever over the conflict in Gaza. Unease over Israel's siege is growing within the Union, but calls for a ceasefire are not universal. With pleas for an end to the fighting seemingly falling on deaf ears and the number of civilian casualties in Gaza climbing by the day, we ask if the European Union has any real influence in the region and the wider Middle East.
So let me start with the humanitarian aid, Kate. Should it be granted to alleviate immediate suffering, or should there be some more strings attached in order to encourage change?
Well, I think the EU is in a difficult position here because obviously there's human suffering and they want to contribute to ending that. But there's also the geopolitical elements, and to ensure that funding is not falling into the hands of a group that has been listed as a terrorist organization. And so they obviously are concerns there, and also the broader geopolitical considerations in regards to different countries' positions. As a 27 bloc, it's hard to always find an agreement among those 27 countries, as we're seeing right now in all the conversations of what's the best way forward and what role is the EU going to be able to play in that.
We'll come to that later, Sven, but the humanitarian aid, we're giving money for this noble cause, alleviate the suffering of civilians, but should we be more forceful in demanding change at the same time?
I think in the short term, nobody can have a lot of influence on the immediate Israeli response to the Hamas terrorist attack. Not even the United States, certainly not the European Union. But it might be, and I do stress, might be a window of opportunity after the end of military operations, I think, to change the vicious cycle, create a breakthrough. And so do not go back to what it was before 7 October. Create a new governance structure for Gaza. And there I think the EU, together with the US, has some diplomatic way to push for that.
Sandra.
Well, I think it was a very good sign that Roberta Metsola and Ursula von der Leyen were one of the first world leaders who visited the kibbutz closest to the Gaza border, where almost 1,300 Israelis were killed and also 240 kidnapped. It was on this visit happened on 13th of October. It was a very good sign. The European Union unanimously decided it is on the side with Israel. Israel has its right to defend itself, but always complying with the humanitarian laws and defending also human rights.
You mentioned Israel. The EU this week discussed funding Israel too, because the EU also gives money to Israel, 18 million here to help Israel with regional cooperation. More strings attached here too? Can we get something in return for this? Or should we be asking this?
I think that the thing is that at this point, Israel, under Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, has really decided the path it wants to go forward, and the US and the EU are going to have to find a way to convince him to agree to any changes, I think, at this point, which no one knows if that's going to be possible, to change the direction. There's a lot of division about what Israel actually wants to do with Gaza in the future now that it's already moved in. So I think there's going to be a lot of eyes are going to be on whether the EU is actually going to be able to do any strings attached to any sort of money to Israel or to the Palestinian territories, frankly.
I would argue here that it's not more the question about what Israel will do next. It's really about we have to look at Hamas and what Hamas wants. And the only goal of Hamas is the complete destruction of Israel. This is what they are preaching. This is what they're teaching also their children, a younger generation too. This is also written in their manifestos. And this is the only take. So meaning that there won't be any solution. No two-state solution, no one-state solution. Also one of the solutions that I've heard lately. Or also confederation. If in coexistence with Hamas. So therefore Hamas needs to be destroyed.
I think, if I may, our message should be more multidimensional than that. I don't think it was a mistake to go to Israel so early, but I think it was a mistake to go only to Israel, because we created a perception in the global south that we are unconditionally behind Israel, which is not the case. There is no such a thing as unconditionality in foreign policy. So I think we should give a combined message, utterly condemn the terrorist attack by Hamas, because the end does not justify the means, but the end is there, the two-state solution. And we should also be clear to Israel that yes, they have the right, the duty to secure their citizens, but not by any means. And two, their long-term strategy is a total failure, because Israel behaves as a colonial power. Belgium, my country, has been a colonial power. We gave up our colonies because we realized in the end you can only maintain them in a permanent stage of war. That should also be made clear to Israel.
Can we do that as EU? There is the German word has the nice word Zahlmeister, which is the one who foots the bill, right? Who pays? The European Union is by far the biggest donor to the Palestinian Authority and to the region at large. Why is it that Europe still doesn't have any meaningful leverage here to bring about change and to push the countries or the players towards a peaceful solution?
And cynically, actually, in a way that helps Israel maintain its colonial policy, because thanks to EU funding, the Palestinian Authority on the West Bank can somehow function, and thus Israel can continue to do what it does in a way on the cheap. But we have little leverage over Israel because we are too divided. And as long as certain member states, specifically Germany, feel that it is Staatsräson, as I've heard German leaders say, to always unconditionally support Israel, then we'll be stuck. And again, I think there cannot be such a thing as unconditional support for another country.
But with all the money we're paying, why don't we have any leverage?
Well, I think the thing is that when it comes to national sovereignty, there's only so much you can do. Even the EU has its limits with its member states. So how are you going to be able to impose what you think is the correct way forward on a sovereign nation that even if you're giving them their money to the country, you can't necessarily walk in and say, you must do this and this and this. And also then there's about the ethics of withdrawing funding. If you put, what kind of strings do you attach to it? Because there is a lot of human suffering there and a lot of people relying on getting some aid. Obviously, of course, ensuring it doesn't fall into the hands of any association that, is considered a terrorist group. So I think that there is obviously that challenge, but I don't think that Brussels can just show up and say, we demand this and this and this. It's not as straightforward as that.
Yeah, it's not only Brussels, it's 27.
Indeed, but also, Kate, you cited sovereign state and what is happening in Gaza and situation in Gaza. And Palestinians, it is not a sovereign state. So Hamas is a terrorist organization. It is defined so by the UK, by the US, the European Union and other countries in the world, especially in the Western world. And also it has came to power illegally, 2006. And also it is not morally equal to be comparing Israel with Hamas in Palestine, because what they're doing, they're not acting as an army. They're not playing according to the rules. They're using humans as the shields. So obviously, and Gaza is also one of the densest regions in the world. It is 41 kilometers wide and 10 long and 10 kilometers long. So therefore, we cannot be comparing. At the moment, there is no solution in coexistence with Hamas.
Well, there's not a solution for 70 years now, right? There's not only Brussels, there are 27 member states, and they all have different approaches to this issue. That became evident this week when the European Parliament debated this issue. And the division here is not only within countries or groups of countries, but also within political families. Take a listen to some of the statements here.
Who on the 7th of October spread death and destruction on a peaceful music festival and several kibbutzes? Exactly, Hamas. And who is using innocent citizens as a human shield? Exactly, Hamas. Hamas has to be taken out of operation. Israel deserves our support.
Why are we waiting to condemn Netanyahu's criminal behaviour? Palestinian children are being killed by Netanyahu's choices, and we have to take a position now. We need to see an immediate end to hostilities to ensure that humanitarian aid can get into Gaza. Israel has a right to defend itself, but not to enact revenge.
These divisions that became apparent here again, is that one of are these one of the weaknesses that we have as a European Union in the Middle East? And how can we reconcile, let's say, the positions of Germany and Austria on one side and Spain and Ireland, the anti-colonial countries on the other? How do we do that?
I'm a bit surprised, one, that everybody seems to forget that there is a firmly rooted EU policy to work for the two-state solution, and that suddenly nobody seems to be talking about it. And two, why is this presented as a choice? Again, I think we must be able to give several messages at the same time and condemn Hamas, but also condemn Israel for their far too unrestrained response, which in the end has the opposite strategic effect of what they want, because they're only making things worse and increasing the risk of escalation. The longer their military operation lasts, the more chance of regional escalation, which would be detrimental for everybody.
Sandra.
Well, for myself, what we've seen there is European Parliament, something that you have freedom of choice, you have freedom of speech, and this is the European Union about. It's about freedom, democracy and peace. All of the three things that are not given in Gaza Strip, and at the moment peace is not given in Israel. So Israel, therefore, also is not happy with the current situation and also the situation they had for the past 70 years. They might have freedom, they might have democracy, they might be better positioned as in opposition with Palestinian people, but there is no peace. So I'm sure there will be a need and interest also from Israel's side to work on a two-state solution. But at the moment, the stakes are high, and what happened on 7th of October, it's too recent. And also it's important to say that Hamas they've planned this attack. We've seen, at the moment, there's still no confirmation of that underneath Al-Shifa hospital in the Gaza city. The tunnels are, they have not been confirmed. There are video footages. There are also some comparison. BBC did one of those, and it is important to say that those tunnels have been planned for months, even from years, from Hamas side. So they intentionally planned using their own people, Palestinian women, Palestinian elderly, Palestinian newborns, as human shields against Israel. And also they attacked Israel only based on their religion, because they were Jewish, and Israel is not doing that.
Kate, the argument that Israel is a democracy and therefore we have to support the state no matter what, is that a valid point here? Because none of the Arab states around Israel is a democratic country. So is that a fair point? We say our first support should go to Israel.
I think it's just a very tricky situation, regardless, in any way that you look at it. It's a very difficult situation. As Sven said, it's the EU policy is the two-state solution. But again, you're dealing with a bunch of elements where the EU also, as a former colonizer in the region, certain countries like France, for example, there's a lot of also baggage there in that history. And a lot of, that also needs to be part of the conversation about, what role does the EU actually have to play in negotiating this and what kind of credibility do they have? And again, Germany is in Austria in an interesting situation also vis-a-vis these conversations. So I think it's really hard to take one stance with 27 countries with all of the different influence and impact they've had in the region and the history there. So I think it's really tough. It's a tough, I'm glad that I don't have to be making that decision because I think it's quite a challenge.
But that's exactly what makes us weak here, right? If we have 27 sources of input, Sven.
I mean, eventually it's clear to me that EU foreign policy and defense policy cannot continue to function like this, and we need to vote to majority voting. Objectively speaking, there is nothing that stands in the way of that. You could do it tomorrow, but of course I can see all the political obstacles why it won't happen.
Several of you mentioned the two-state solution. That was one thing that Josep Borrell mentioned in the aftermath of the beginning of the attack. And several EU leaders underlined that policy that is still in place. But nobody reacted to this. Neither Israel nor the United States. It is something that, goes out and disappeared. That is, again, the core of the issue here. EU diplomacy cannot impose its strategy. Is there a strategy at all? Sandra.
Well, if it were be, obviously the EU is pledging, and European Parliament's President Roberta Metsola also stressed it, for a two-state solution, because one-state solution for Israel would just not be acceptable. They would be a minority, and also Israel is not just a state, it's also for them a homeland for the Jewish nation in general. However, it is just too early to talk about it. There was just agreed a ceasefire to be halted at airstrikes from the Israeli side for 6 days, for 6 hours during the 4 days, in exchange of hostages, in exchange of 50 children and women. We are still seeing on social media different footages of what has happened on the 7th of October. So it is just too early to talk about any solution at this moment,
so
and with existence with Hamas.
Was it wrong from Borrell and all the others to bring this up?
I would say after 75 years of Israel-Palestine conflict, it's hardly too early to talk about a solution. I would say you have to do it now. I think actually the United States, the current US government, is playing a very constructive role. You see Secretary of State Blinken working the region, trying to mitigate the risk of escalation, trying to work with leaders. I think the Americans are hopeful that there could be this window of opportunity to not go back to the status quo ante. And we should now fully support that rather than continue to dither among ourselves.
I said it's too early because obviously on the other side, in Gaza Strip, there is no credible partner. So who do you want to talk about? Hamas?
But there will never be a partner if you don't put something on the table. We have to put something serious on the table now. How are we going to solve this?
But our problem is always that we are in equidistance to both players. The US has leverage because they're siding with Israel always, and the Palestinian, the Qatar, they have some leverage, and they negotiated this deal here because they're very close to Hamas. If we're sort of in the middle between everybody, we don't have leverage, despite all the money we're providing.
I think this is the Achilles heel of the European Union in foreign policy, is like you have huge countries like Germany, France, with seats at the UN Security Council, for example. The EU doesn't have a seat there, even though, of course, there's a lot of conversations about the UN nowadays and how effective it actually is. That's actually been floated as a solution, with its own conversation around that. But I think that that's really one of the issues the EU has always had, even in keeping its own house in order with rule of law, for example. Viktor Orban in Hungary has been able to dismantle a lot of the democratic institutions in the country, and they're still part of the EU. So I think there's a lot of conversations there as to how the EU responds as a unit, and even internally, that's a struggle, let alone when you go into the international scene.
Okay, you mentioned Viktor Orban. That is a great issue for the next round. And thank you so far for a great conversation. We're going to take a break now. And when we come back, is Spain becoming the next EU country with rule of law issues? That's next on Brussels, my love. Stay with us. Welcome back to Brussels, my love. Our guests are still Kate Bolongaro, Sven Biskup, and Sandra Pasaric. Let's move on to our second topic, the rule of law situation in Europe following the passage of an amnesty law in Spain. The law was part of a deal between the Spanish socialists and Catalan separatists to keep Pedro Sanchez in power. Critics argue sharply that Sanchez's government will now be at the mercy of traitors to the country. This prompted a debate in the European Parliament, called for by the centre-right European People's Party and Renew. The EPP's chairman Manfred Weber told Euronews that Sanchez's move was the beginning of the end of the rule of law in Spain. Take a listen.
What we need is to keep rule of law high, not only in Central Eastern European countries, but also in the so-called Western and classical EU countries. We are giving pardon to thousands of people, and that is a lot. And it's obvious that Sanchez is doing this only to get the votes, the 7 votes from Puigdemont to govern the country. So it's about his personal egoism.
So, first of all, I think Weber is exaggerating here. It's not thousands of people that are benefiting from the amnesty law, but hundreds, right? But that brings us right to the core of the debate here. All this outrage that we're seeing on the right, is it just politics, or does it have some merit, Sandra?
No, it is indeed not politics. I have myself lived in Barcelona, in Catalonia, on 2017. So I lived the referendum, 1st of October 2017. I've seen what was happening on the streets prior to it. I was also following it before, it is indeed 1,000 people, because it's amnesty law also goes in both directions. So it's going to be, it's supposed to be pardoned not only the Catalan separatist leaders and also everybody involved in the process, but also police officers and so on.
Right, right. But what the public is looking at is at the people who were in prison, the Catalan leaders who were in prison and who will now be able to return to politics. And then there are, of course, the people who escaped to Belgium, Puigdemont. They will be able to return to Spain without being arrested. How will that change the political arena, the political discourse in Spain?
Well, I think you're seeing it a lot in the press right now. There's a lot of conversations about the fact that, this is just for Sanchez to be able to get power after Feijóo was unable to, from the Partido Popular, was unable to actually form a government. So there is a lot of questions, and I think there's a lot of anger in Spain, at least from what we see, people are demonstrating against this. There's a lot of concern about how this is actually going to impact. There is a bit of Sanchez does kind of present this holier than thou presence sometimes, and I think there's a lot of questions about whether he's still going to be able to maintain that kind of a discourse since this has happened, and to what extent is he willing to upset a large part of the Spanish population for his own political gains, because there's been a lot of pushback on this, even from socialists within his own party who are saying we can't get behind this, like we don't support this even if we're socialists. So I think it's a big conversation there.
The bill was very carefully drafted by the Spanish government because they wanted to avoid any criticism here. Are there any legal hurdles on Spanish or European level that could be a problem for this?
Well, on Wednesday evening, it was discussed during the plenary session in Strasbourg, the whole possibility of the amnesty laws and whether it is legal or within the constitution or not. As such, there are some jurists in Spain who are saying that it is not embedded in the constitution, but some again are saying that the constitution does not prohibit it. We've seen it in 1977 after the Civil War. So years after the Civil War, there was a so-called amnesty process that was supposed to grant amnesty to those who did atrocities during the Spanish Civil War, during the Franco era in Spain. So now what is happening, and basically why this is such an issue and why they are daily protest in Spain is that Sanchez, he lied about his deal. So he never talked about it during his electoral campaign on 23rd of July. He did everything to hold on the power. He sold indeed his government now to gain this extra 7 seats, to gain this extra support. And also it's important to say that amnesty is different than the pardon. He did already back in June 2021, he pardoned 9 Catalan separatists who were in jail, and they're now back in politics. So this already happened. Despite all of that, independent movement is losing on its popularity in Catalonia itself. And nowadays, if there were to be discussion in the Catalan parliament, it would not have majority.
I'm hesitating to compare Spain to Hungary, for instance, but it has been already discussed on the European level. Sven, is there a general tendency in Europe to take these sort of rule of law issues lightly or not so seriously? If countries, they look at Hungary and Poland and say, look, they can get away with it, why don't we do the amnesty bill?
I would see the opposite, actually. I think we have belatedly come to the conclusion that Poland and Hungary should not get away with it. And of course, the problem is that we all thought that once a country becomes democratic, it can never go back. The 1930s should have told us otherwise. And so we came up with mechanisms to try and deal with it very late. So I would say the opposite. We become quite aware of threats to the freedoms that are actually enshrined in the EU treaty.
There's also the issue of national reconciliation. That is what Sanchez's party and he himself has said. Is that what it is in Spain? Are we seeing this, or is it more an attempt of a desperate politician to stay in power? What about this argument, national reconciliation?
I think that there's still an existence to Spain. That's what a lot of Spaniards talk about is, there's people whose relationship with the dictatorship was a more positive one and ones that's more negative. And that's very divisive still to this day in Spain. So I think talking about national reconciliation in Spain, you have to actually go back even further and include more than just about the independence movement in Catalonia, for example. Spain is quite divided, and there's a lot of also other regions that have strong movements, like the Basque Country. And so it's really hard to focus that one story as the narrative of reconciliation in a country that is so fractured and has been since its return to democracy after the transition in the early 1980s. And so I think that this is a core issue, and he's probably going to bring out more tensions.
Okay, I'm afraid that's all we have time for on that topic. Thanks to our panel here in the studio, and thanks for watching. See you soon here on Euronews. Welcome back to Brussels, my love, our talk show about some of the week's main events. And now to something special. British filmmaker Ridley Scott's latest movie Napoleon opened this week in theaters across Europe. A 2-hour, 38-minute historical spectacle complete with bloody battles and massive military maneuvers. But don't mistake Napoleon for your average historical epic in which the hero is being glorified. Scott's Napoleon is a boyishly impulsive, thin-skinned brute careening his way through Europe and leaving battlefields of dead soldiers in his wake. I'm sure the movie will draw criticism from many sides. The big question is, though, how do you depict someone who, for more than 200 years, has been characterized as everything from genius reformer to tyrannical psychopath? And my question to you is, why are we still fascinated by Napoleon? Sven?
Well, I must confess, so was I. As a teenager, I knew everything about Napoleon's battles. I painted tin soldiers. I could tell you which uniform of the Imperial Guard changed in which year and reenact the whole Battle of Waterloo. And I think the fascination is, of course, the achievement to create this enormous empire, but also to lose it in such a short time. It's the drama. Now, if I look at it professionally, so to say, as someone who then later began to write and think about strategy, then you realize that he was a master of tactics and operations, but a total failure at grand strategy. because he won nearly every battle. He actually also won nearly every war, but he never consolidated his gains, and so he just ended up losing everything.
But there are other aspects. There's Josephine, there's his private life, the domestic agenda. What is it that makes Napoleon still a figure that we want to see a movie about?
Well, he's a divisive figure full of drama, and I think that that's always going to attract humankind for as long as we exist on this planet. We like those stories, and he's a good story, and he can be interpreted many different ways. So it sounds like that's what Ridley Scott has done here. There are many portraits of Napoleon that were quite positive, books, but you would have positive notions, Hitler or other dictators that try to conquer Europe. What is the difference between Hitler and Napoleon?
Well, I think Napoleon was not on an ideological crusade, and obviously didn't plan a genocide. He planned to create a dynasty and an empire. And he also made contributions that still have a great impact. If you think of the legislation, the Code Napoleon, even parts of current Belgian law are still based on that. And for the French, Napoleon created the Légion d'honneur, which still has a great mystique in France. So his legacy is probably more present than we realize somewhere in the background.
Is it fair that we let a British filmmaker do a movie on Napoleon in English?
It's probably odd that they all speak English, whereas obviously everyone knows that they all spoke French, and even all the big diplomatic
I think
were in French.
Ridley Scott told a critic, who said that the historical facts are a little wobbly here. Scott said, just get a life. So and the British press loved the movie, the Anglo-Saxon press, I should say, but obviously in France it was different. But it's interesting that you, as a Belgian, or as a you're kind of in the French cultural orbit, but when you talk to people about this, do you hear different, categorical statements on Napoleon?
Well, I'm a Dutch speaker, actually, so I'm not sure if I'm fully in the French cultural orbit. I think the nice thing about Belgium is we're right in the middle between the French and the German cultural orbit. Of course, there is this fascination because Waterloo, the final battle, is here. And the interesting thing is that Belgians fought on both sides at Waterloo, so we would always have won.
Good. That's a nice conclusion. And that does it for us today on Brussels, My Love. I'd like to thank our guests for a fascinating conversation and you at home for watching. And if you want to reach out to us, you can send us a note to brusselsmylove@euronews.com with comments or ideas, or contact us on social media. I'm Stefan Grobes. See you soon here on Euronews and euronews.com. Take care and goodbye.